Thanks, Dr. Aquino. We're going to spend a little bit of time wrapping up in terms of information you've requested on how we're thinking through the issues of devices, safety, both project demonstration and acquisition. And we're going to ask if Ron could begin this part of it, and then Mark would finish up for us. Thank you.
Good morning, committee members. Ron Chandler, Chief Information Officer. I'll just do a quick walkthrough of some of the specifics that you've asked for. Let me also say that we're excited about this. The timing is right. The stars are aligned on this one. And had we started this a year ago, we wouldn't be ready. If we started a year from now, we'd be too late. And so what I love about this conversation is that it is driven by instruction and learning and not by technology. So you have the technologists saying that. Let me just dive right in and say a few things. In terms of devices, we're not talking about leasing these devices. We are talking about purchasing them. So that was one of the questions that you had. In terms of useful life, there was a conversation about making certain that the devices are around long enough for a refresh cycle. And so we're going to ask our partners in the industry to help us with that. And so how do we get creative? This is a massive project, and we think it's complicated, but it doesn't have to be overly complex. And so we're going to lean on our partners to do that. In the sense that we don't roll out all day one, we are going to have to accommodate a bring your own device. So we're thinking about how we do that in terms of a short-term strategy until we actually do roll out. I tend to think that we could be a little bit more aggressive, and I hope that you agree with that and help us with that. But in the interest of making sure that we manage this properly, we're taking a BYOD approach. Day one, we're not talking about taking home any devices. These devices stay on the campus. And since we are talking about devices staying on the campus, we don't see this as a Williams compliance issue. If you go to the next slide, and I won't read all this text, but basically there are two types of security that we're concerned about. Physical security. I mean, if you think about this, we now will have devices in pretty much every classroom in our schools. And so we are talking to the police departments, and how other districts have done this is they've convened conversations with local municipality, local police to address that. And we'll do that internally as well. And then what we're also concerned about is virtual security. How do we make sure that when you sign on to these devices, we know who you are, we know when you're on the devices, and we know how to make sure that should these devices walk away, we know how to make sure we kill the devices so that information is not compromised. And so there are tools that we can certainly purchase to do that. And we'll talk more about that in the future slides. We did have a conversation with the Office of Environmental Health and Safety, and one of the concerns that you've raised was the issues around microwave waves and so radiation. So they're looking at this, and part of this planning and assessment phase is to really get a really good conversation around what's acceptable, what's not only acceptable, but what is healthy. And so, of course, we're not interested in harming our students. And so the OEHS department will do that. In terms of loss, we're going to expect some level of loss. There are some smaller school districts that have done this over the years. And while there's loss with textbooks, there's loss in other devices, we expect there to be some loss. And the question is, how do we deal with that? How do we both prevent that from happening, lower the probability of loss, and then potentially how do we recover devices when they're lost? So you'll see a lot of that in the plans as well. And we have some really good ideas, and there are good products in the market that'll help us with this. In terms of funding, and I know there'll be a further discussion, multiple ways of funding this. Clearly, we're before you today because we're interested in expecting that we would leverage bond funds. And so we have met multiple times with legal counsel and to get guidance around how do we do this. And we also expect there'll be other types of funding leveraged in this whole this plan. Long term, the question is how do we make sure that we have the right people? As Dr. Aquino said, it is about providing the right levels of support. And our team in the IT side, we're getting ready for this. So we're ramping up and learning how to manage this. It is about what happens in that classroom. And we want to make sure that we provide the level of support and customer support to make sure that the students and teachers get what they need. And so we're excited about that. We are also looking at how do we make sure we beef up the infrastructure. We're talking about potentially upwards of 700,000 devices on our network, which we're not prepared for today. We have prepared for that by way of the IT Strategic Execution Plan, which you approved several months ago for some of that work, and some of the work was not identified, so we'll have to come back and speak to that. Investment, and so today we're coming to you to talk to you a little bit about how do we invest in certainly the first portion of that. And so as we finish phase 1A, we'll come back to you with a detailed plan on how we move forward, and it'll have a lot of the specifics around devices and content and all the things that you've asked us. The second point I do want to talk a little bit about is network modernization. Again, we're talking about a massive use of technology in the classrooms, and many of the classrooms that were not designed for that initially. And so we have to beef up the infrastructure to accommodate that. And so, again, part of the SCP spoke to beefing up the infrastructure anyway. This actually accelerates the whole process a bit, and so there'll be a conversation we'll have about that. In terms of the cost around devices, we're assuming a range between $400 to $800 per device, and of course we think that that price will decrease as time goes along. We see a day when these really become commodity products, and so the question is, how do we get in front of that wave before in time enough to take advantage of the pricing opportunities. Okay, so let me walk through some of the details of the investment. And so I think there were questions around, and before you have the itemized listing of investments, but I think there were questions around identity management, email collaboration, and monitoring and management systems. We're putting a lot of technology on our infrastructure. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, we have to know where these devices are. We have to know that you are in fact who you say you are when you log into these devices. So there are tools out there that help us do that. All of these projects and products, if you will, were actually identified in our previously presented strategic execution plan. So nothing that we're presenting here is a new ask in terms of the work. What we're asking for is some of the funding. And so with that, let me forward it to Mark Hovarder to speak through funding strategy.
Morning, Mark Hovarder, Chief Facility Executive. I want to emphasize first that this is not a question of whether this initiative is more important than the Early Ed Center. You'll see on the slide that's mentioned the Early Ed Center. This is completely about a timing and a cash flow issue. So I want to make sure that's clear. We're not saying that one element is more important than the other. But what we tried to do was look at where the cash was available and where it's needed and where it's being used. I want to remind the committee that under James Son, there was a very favorable bid environment, and there was a creation of a SIPR, Capital Improvement Fund, basically, that was created by taking reserve, reducing the amount of reserve that we thought we needed to finish the construction program. And there were various programs that were created out of that, and one of those was the Early Ed Centers, which allocated $40 million. Of that $40 million, there's still $16.3 million that has not yet been allocated. And in addition to that, there's a project for an Early Ed Center in South Region 3. It's in the Cudahy area that has actually been put on hold and is not being built. That's another 10.3. So altogether, there's $26.5 million of unallocated money. Now, there certainly are some things that Early Ed Center intends to have allocated in the very near future, but this plan looks at borrowing $17.5 million of that unallocated money to allow us to proceed, and that leaves $9 million to continue to do all the programs. And we believe that's going to be able to keep them going in pace with the things that they believe they need to do until such time that they're ready to move forward. And at that point, we believe the cash flow situation will be resolved. I mentioned at the last committee meeting, we're creating the RRR, the reserve, recovery, and reallocation. As we wind down our construction projects where we've got less risk and we're able to draw down on our reserve, we're also closing out projects which release money that's available. In a perfect world, that would be available right now, and we could use that for this initiative that we've got for the devices, but that's not, although we do expect, and we're actually seeing it start to roll in now. And then over the course of the next several months, we expect more to come in, and we think there'll be more than enough money in that reserve allocation to be able to pay back this money as we allocate it. It is not a priority at all. It's just a simple cash flow and a net reallocation. So we have a project going to the board on December 11th, and essentially you've got a copy of it in your book, and it's going to be an action to adjust two strategic execution plans. One is to reduce the facility strategic execution plan by the $17.5 million that we talked about, and it will come specifically from that SIPR project that involved the Early Ed Center, and it will ask to increase the funding for the ITD strategic execution plan, and that will authorize them to enter into Phase 1A.
Thank you.
So obviously, we're here to answer questions or to get additional information if you need it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. First of all, that was very comprehensive presentation. We do, as you might expect, have some questions, but I want to thank you again for responding to the specific questions that we had raised with you previously, and I understand we can look forward to some further responses to the letter that we sent last week. And so we'll be looking forward to that as well. But I think you've made a very good start here with the presentation today, particularly with respect to the earlier questions. Let me just kind of go through some questions I have, and I know the other members, I suspect the other members are going to have some as well. These are really more in the nature of trying to get some clarification. First, with respect to the governance structure, the slide that has the organizational chart on it, I had some difficulty following. You have, as I understand it, you've got at the very top of this structure, you've got an executive steering committee, and then down at the next level, you have a project steering committee. I gather those two are pretty much the same.
So you have subgroups within that. So,
Yes,
for
yes.
example, we may have someone specific within procurement that's on the project steering committee, but then we have Mr. Hovater's team on the executive committee.
All right. Now, looking down to the project steering, I sort of see what the membership is of the project steering committee, and then I go down the list to something called a project technical team. It looks to me that I just wanted to know what's the difference between the. It looks like the constituents are the same, and the question is: are the people on the project technical team there in the project team? Are those the same individuals, or are they lower? Are they different people from different places in the management structure, filling out those positions and matching the input from people in a different place within the same office at the higher level committee?
A good example, so you could understand the difference. One would be if we were moving this out for one of our intensive support special education sites, the project technical team would have a very different group of individuals from the Office of Special Education Support and Curriculum than would a project management team. Mathematics, same thing. So these are considered to be folks who would have either instructional expertise that is narrow, such as subject matter and or grade level, or they would have school structure expertise. We have span schools that really would have a treatment very differently because they're a K-8 school than just a high school. And you would want folks who understood the instruction across a span school, an early childhood center, or a high school.
So what it sounds like to me is that the project team, or at least the project technical team, constituents are going to vary depending on the school that you're dealing with?
Content, school structure, age of youth.
So there'll be different project technical team. In other words, it's project technical teams rather than project technical team.
Or members of that team.
Yeah. Okay. I do notice here that you've got, this is obviously a matter of interest to the BOC. You've got the BOC listed here as a member of one of these advisory committees. It's the first I've heard of that. Naturally would be interested to hear more about that going forward. You don't need to talk about that today. But I'm glad that you have considered us as part of the effort here.
Well, Mr. Rubin's been very helpful so far, so we want to have as many people involved in this project going forward.
Thank you.
I mean, we see you at periodic events. I get to see him daily, and there is a continuity to this that we think
Yes.
is pretty important.
Yes. Well, Mr. Rubin is a tremendous asset, I think, not only to the BOC in this, but I think he can be a tremendous asset to your to this effort as well. There's a term that gets used here, and just forgive me for not knowing it, solution architecture.
Yeah, you want to talk about that? Ron, you want to share how we think about that?
So I think the nuance on the charts are that the project team, they're doing a lot of the day-to-day work, and then the resources on the ground, if you will, and then steering committees really sort of manage the resources and lead the resources in the department. Solutions architect it's really that. It's a person who's going to design this massive system that we're putting in place. So they're actually developing solutions based on the resources we have, both technically and from a content perspective. And so they are the ones that are developing blueprints, and they're the ones that are spending time with the ultimate end users and making sure we're designing the right systems for use by our constituents.
So, all right, I'll take that for now. It's still a little fuzzy in my
Okay.
mind, but I won't delay us too much there. You mentioned that there are some schools, some additional schools that you're looking at for the future demonstration project. Are any of those additional schools elementary schools, middle schools?
Yes, a good example would be Maywood Elementary. Another example would be Melrose Elementary. So is it Menlo? Yep. So there's at least 3. We can bring you a list of them all, actually.
That's all right.
Okay.
I wanted to be sure that we had both some middle schools and some elementary
Yep.
schools in that early
I would,
mix.
whoever had time, certainly to 2-hour at Maywood or Melrose is beyond enlightening.
Well, a number of us went to Ivanhoe and King last week,
Yep.
and I must say it was very enlightening. And
Yep.
we very much enjoyed seeing how a lot of this stuff is working on the ground.
Yeah, I think, if I remember correctly, I think Stevenson would be the 3rd middle school.
I'm sorry?
Stevenson would
Stevenson.
be the 3rd middle school.
Okay.
Okay.
Reference was made under training, support, and content to something called a knowledge database, helping district stakeholder self-support databases. I must say, I had a hard time visualizing what that was.
So it's a knowledge management system that allows you to input case studies and work that you've done and then share it with others. So it's a best practices kind of a system. And so as you learn, you put it into the system, and any key stakeholder or the project gets a copy of this information. And it actually fields the information and distributes this information to relevant parties. And so that's how we continue to learn as we go along on the project.
All right, and
So
that's
for example, currently in the entire performance management system, we use ClearPoint,
Right.
as an example.
all right. Same kind of question for this something called a learning management system. I see we've allocated some money for that. What is a learning management
Do you
system?
want to talk about, it's the same idea.
Yeah. So it's the same idea in terms of having all the information regarding teaching and learning. So a teacher will have access to all the information, data on a particular student, lessons, intervention, but also coupled with the acknowledgement system that they can upload. Let's say a piece of student work with a commentary can share with other colleagues. So everything is there.
Are you familiar with our system called My Data, which is the system in LAUSD, which by classroom brings up all of your classroom achievement data around students? Imagine marrying that to the student work that's produced under the Common Core, and you have a learning management system.
I see. Okay, thank you. That helps a lot. Useful life. I'm obviously this is an issue of great interest to us because bond funds are long-term investments, and you I see you here are asking right now. You're at the stage of asking vendors to respond as to how they can ensure that there will be a 10-year useful life. And I'm not going to press you for further details today, but I did want to let you know that this is something that we would need more specifics on when you return.
Definitely. It's also why we would want industry to help us clarify that, either replace, refresh, but useful life is another a non-investment for that period of time. I say that like I could just create that, but you know what we're saying.
Yes, it's not an easy problem. I understand. All right. Well, I'm.
Now there's a number of specifics we just got. We're writing those to you from your November 9th letter. Okay.
Yes. One question about the funding here, and this I think this was actually a question that was in the letter, but I'd like to get it clarified. You have here that a total figure of 17 million, let's call it 17 million 5,
Yep.
that you're asking us to approve today. But as I understand it, about almost 3 million of that is already part of the IT strategic execution plan that we approved, that the board approved. In May. So are we, is further approval needed for that 3 million? I mean, it's part of the 17, but so are you coming back to us essentially and asking, because when I look asking for an additional 17 or asking for an additional 12, when I look at how you're moving funds that are allocated to the early childhood education program, it looks like 17.
Right. So in our strategic execution plan, we identified this as a project that we would proceed with that was approved by Bond Council, but we did not identify funding for it.
I see. Okay, that clarifies it. Sure. Thank you very much. All right. Well, I've taken much too much time with questions here, so let me turn to the other members of the committee and see what questions they have.
I have a question around the designated source for this, and I know that I guess a few years back we had already borrowed money from early childhood education, had finally put those resources back, and I'm wondering why, again, early childhood education. I know that, especially for communities like mine where children don't necessarily have access to a very rich, I guess don't have the same exposure to language and reading and books. I'm just really concerned about again, removing resources from early childhood education to do this, and I just want to understand a little bit why that was done.
So I just want to make a point of clarification. This has to deal with the movement of funds that are bond funds, so programmatic funds are not part of this, and that, so when we talked about the items that you just mentioned, they're definitely not part of bond funding, but if you want to continue to comment on that, please.
I just wanted to reiterate it. It's just a question of cash flow. There was earlier $40 million that was borrowed from the program that was restored. We restored the $40 million 2 years ago, and of that $40 million, there's still $26.5 million that hasn't been executed yet. That hasn't even been identified, except for a $10 million school that we're getting ready to cancel. So it's just a question of cash flow. There are some other projects, about $9 million, that have been identified but have not yet been formally approved and presented to this group. So that money's still available for everything that's being brought forward. We anticipate that long before there are other projects that are identified for the remaining money, the money will become available through our reserve recovery. So it's strictly a cash flow. It's not saying we're taking anything away from anyone that's prepared. There's no project that's going to go on hold by making this cash flow adjustment.
So I just have a question in terms of this reserve recovery. Is there already a system in place to decide how that reserve recovery, like the priorities for the use of those funds will be, and will early child education facilities, and I understand the difference between facilities and program, how they all get prioritized in that.
The reserve recovery reallocation was just created last month. We're getting the first funds that are getting put into that yet. The priority system of how that's going to be funded is something that we're working on right now. It'll be brought forward and presented to the board at a future date of how it's going to get set up. But certainly at the head of that priority is going to be money that was borrowed and that's going to be set up.
Or said another way, you all shape that.
Yes, and also I think one of the things I understand you to be saying is that as funds become available from the remainder of Measure R and the other sales and Measure Q, that those funds would also be available to repay anything that's been deferred.
That's absolutely correct. But the Triple R specifically is for bonds that have already been sold. It's essentially coming in under budget, and we're recovering that money. In addition to that, we have the sale of R and Y to the tune of $675 million that haven't been sold yet, and Q, whichever of those became available first or at the time that it was necessary to proceed with the early ed project, then certainly that would be the priority we'd take it from.
So, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I want to say that when we came back to you, one of the things that we were very, very mindful of is that the phasing of this doesn't stop other work that was planned, as opposed to taking a large chunk and then freezing work that's going to take place. So we heard that, and I think this absolutely represents that thinking. Yep.
Speaking of phasing, do you have a rough estimate of when these phases would be happening?
Yeah, let me show you that slide. We went over that actually pretty quickly. So 1A this is November. Hopefully we'll move this and then move that planning phase through till the end of February of this particular academic year and readiness. From February to October, that's halfway through the rest of this year into the beginning of the next academic year, is the projects that I'm going to flip really quickly, that we spoke about right here. The readiness and demonstration sites, as we begin through March till the end of next academic year, we could include up to an additional 100 demonstrated projects selected on both vision, readiness, and rollout that we learned from the selection site. And then phase 2 would begin in on or about August of 2013 into the 13-14, 14-15 school year. And that, of course, will be brought to you for determination once we have lessons learned from the first 2 phases. So it could be rapid, it could not be rapid. I think it's not for us to say at the moment, other than at this scale, it's not going to be within 1 year.
Right. That makes sense.
Academic year.
So sort of having to do with the phases between 1A and 2 for that matter. So I see there's a list of the schools that are have ready infrastructure for one-to-one devices. That's very exciting. That's
so for
you'll be
those who
selecting
are
from
not
those for
seeing that,
phase
who are
1B.
watching this,
Right.
so there's an appendix which is available, which are schools that we provide you, which are the demonstration project sites, and those that have been declared as readiness. And we've provided those appendices to the bond oversight, and they're available to anybody who'd like to take a look at that.
And after that, for phase, I don't know if it would be happening, I guess also during phase 1B, you'll be modernizing an additional list of about 150 schools. And so my question then has to do with the rest of the schools, sort of the limbo schools. Will they be not infrastructure ready, already ready enough? Or
So we are working on preparing for infrastructure, which is a separate book of work that's taking place around this.
Okay.
But I'm going to speak and then ask Jaime to correct me if we agree on this, because I think we agree on this, but we'd be glad to disagree in front of you if that works. This will definitely flow by grade level and subject matter in terms of demands from the state on students for readiness for assessments and curriculum rollout. So having them go to schools that might be ready for students who really don't have a demand yet from the state as to those who actually must take this assessment, we're going to tip to those who have this kind of demand in front of them to be ready for the state assessment program.
So when you say schools that have the demand from the state, you're saying by grade level or schools that are struggling?
No,
I
by
don't
grade level, ma'am.
Okay, but that's pretty much,
Well, we don't test in kindergarten, we don't test in first grade.
right, right.
There are some subjects that are not tested in ninth grade, for example. So we need to figure out where the greatest demands are and make sure they're ready for those first.
Right, but that, realistically, you're talking about every school, but just certain grade levels, because you have, there are key grade levels in both elementary.
Middle and high school. That is
right?
correct.
So, okay, all right, so phase 2 then will theoretically touch every school as currently envisioned, just,
Oh, definitely.
certain grade levels are prioritized, okay.
Correct. But educationally,
Right.
you might want to deal with like all middle schools, since
Right.
the project team would be dealing with middle school math and middle school English language arts at one time. That would by what we mean in terms of that piece. You might want to do upper elementary versus early elementary.
Right, that makes sense.
But it does actually affect every single school.